Welcome everyone to Rules Explained. In this episode, we're going over Flames of War. We're taking a break from our nostalgic old games, and we're going to start with a semi-new one, the Flames of War. I'm John Merritt,
I'm Rob Nothing.
and we have a guest star joining us. We have Sean joining us, our local historian,
Hello.
and we're going to be going over Flames of War. Rob, tell us about the start of this game. When did it come out?
Well, Flames of War came out in 2002, and it continues in a long line of simulation games that came out in the 50s and the 60s that simulated what was then modern warfare, and now is, of course, the Second World War. During the 50s and 60s, there was I don't know, I was going to say resurgence. I would say not a resurgence, but an actual renaissance in gaming in which people were going ahead and looking back at the Second World War and looking to ways to go and apply the tried and true methods of miniature wargaming to the Great War that was just fought. So they went ahead and created many different rule sets, most of them involving miniatures, but then again, eventually involving board games, the most famous of which being Panzer Blitz and Panzer Leader, and then, of course, evolving into a game called Squad Leader. This would eventually create the modern set of miniatures for wargaming of this time period, the 20th century, that would become Flames of War.
So the World War II miniature games, 1939 to 41 and 1944 to 45. So it sounds like in this game they're going from the early World War II to the late World War II. Not much in the middle.
It appears to me like they're focusing on what I would call the sexy parts of World War II.
Mm-hmm.
The sexy parts of World War II are the beginning years where Germany is basically running without any sort of opposition all over Europe and is cleaning up almost everywhere they go with very good efficiency. And then the other part of this sexy war would be the Western theater of operations and the Eastern theater of operations, in which the Soviet Union and the Americans are now turning the tables on the Nazis and their fascist regime.
When was Germany in Africa? When was the time frame for that?
Sean, would you like to take that, or would you like me to field that one?
So typically, Rommel was there around at the start, actually, since 1940 to around 42, near the Mediterranean.
And those particular engagements don't fall under my category, and I keep using the term sexy. I hope I'm not offending anyone that's listening, but I use the same term when I talk to my students quite often, because people don't really get that excited about desert warfare. It was non-consequential to many people for the entirety of the conflict, and it involved units that did not have the same flair or did not invoke the same amount of imagination. And the same could go for the Italian campaigns, 42, 43. Not a lot of literature or movies or films about those things. The biggest one I can think of, whoops, I just made a pun, is the Big Red one.
Oh,
Yeah.
what threw me off about this game was who created it. A company in New Zealand,
Yeah. Yeah.
because they're so known for their tanks. I say sarcastically. I mean, does New Zealand even have tanks?
Well, I'm sure
Send
they
the
were
email
using.
to johnmerritt@gmail.com.
Yeah, exactly. You just lost our entire audience from the Southern
New
Hemisphere.
Zealand is
Thank
off
you.
the map. Well, I can actually answer that. So they
Go
do
for it.
have tanks. They were typically given them, or they were supplied them by Great Britain near the end of the war, at least. Um, Before that, however, since most of the steel and the lend-lease from America was going to England, they did try to make their own tank, and this is where we get the legendary Bob Semple tank, which is unfortunately not a model in this game, and I will be writing them a letter about it.
I mean,
Yeah,
recently, at least in the past 10, 15 years, even on the computer side, there have been a lot of tank games. World of Tanks being, a huge one. War Thunder being another huge one. It's just tanks for some reason. I don't know what it is about just fleets of tanks that get people excited.
it's again going back to that phrase, the sexy war. If you go back to the First World War, there was absolutely nothing sexy about that war. That was just blood, destruction, maiming,
Trench
um,
warfare.
trench warfare. Well,
Yeah.
stereotypically, yes, absolutely.
Give
And
kids want
there's
some
no,
cholera?
yeah, exactly. Trench foot, you name it, just everything that could go wrong in warfare did. So there's nothing that people like to simulate. Although, ironically enough, you can get, or you could get at one point, Flames of War, World War One. But that's another topic for another video. But in essence, yeah, I mean, it is the armored vehicle that gets a lot of attention in World War II, which is why, and I'm going to pivot on that, John, which is why I think their Japanese line kind of faded because there was a Pacific Theater set of miniatures available for Flames War. I can't find it anymore,
Oh, the,
and
the
that's
Japanese had a ton of tanks in World War II.
yes, but that was not the focus of operations, at least in the islands, where again the sexiness comes in. Nobody thinks sexy when they think of Chinese versus Japanese, or later in the war, Soviets versus Japanese. They only think,
Hmm.
when you think about sexy, you think about Americans storming the beach, and there you
It
don't find
is.
tanks unless you get to the Philippines.
I mean, World War II had very two different kinds of war. The one in Europe was a very different war than what was in the Pacific.
Yes,
Very, very different. I mean, it was just almost night and day in the types of strategies they used, where the Japanese had taken all the islands and, I mean, they were bleeding the Americans, hoping that they would just demoralize the Americans and then quit. I mean, that
right.
was, I think, their best hope for an outcome. But they did have a lot of really interesting tanks as well.
But
Sean, what
primarily,
kind of tanks did they
uh,
have?
Well, there's actually something interesting with Japan that not a lot of other nations had to deal with, and that they had their navy and their army had a rivalry that typically got in the way
yes,
of a lot of production. So they were constantly fighting over steel, for example. A lot of it mainly went to the Navy. So what tanks the Japanese did have, and they did have a good few tanks. I believe like the Eno was one of them. Um, they were
well,
typically used for either defending areas they already had, or
the
excuse me.
Japanese fell into the same trap that many countries did from the mid 30s up until the Germans taught everybody the lesson of armored warfare, and that the Japanese, the French, the Americans, the Polish, and the Russians, even early on, saw the tank as a support vehicle for infantry operations and did not see it as an entity unto itself able to go ahead and conduct its own independent offensive operations. Well, I shouldn't say independent because obviously you have combined arms and so on and so forth. But as the main thrust of your offensive operations, many nations did not think in those terms. So many of the Japanese tanks, in addition to what you were saying, Sean, as far as the competitive nature between the Army and the Navy, the Japanese focused their attention on infantry support tanks rather than anything that was considered to be even a medium tank. I think they only had, what, one medium tank?
Typically they had around four: the Chi-He, the Chi-Nu, the Chi-Tu, and the Chi-Ri. Types 1 through 5. 1, 3, 4, 5. I don't know what happened to 2.
Lost in development. Weren't tanks kind of originally seen like armored artillery, where it was mobile?
Yes, in many ways, that's exactly the way they were seen. And in also many ways, the cavalry, the old school cavalry generals and officers began thinking of the tank as a screening force and or scouting force, which is why you see a lot of emphasis on light vehicles and vehicles that have maneuverability. Find the enemy, report back to where the enemy is, and we'll send the infantry in. But again, the lessons of Blitzkrieg, which by the way did not use very many um, or I should say very many medium tanks at all. There's a interesting story there, which we won't get into. But
That'll be for
nonetheless,
another episode.
yeah, exactly. Nonetheless, the idea of the armored weapon, the armored vehicle being used as the primary method of conducting offensive operations was fairly new. I mean, the American General Patton might be one of the only American generals that thought in those lines.
So in the contents for these rules, we're going to start with playing Flames of War. The challenge of command. This is a 15 millimeter to scale, which is interesting, to scale for the tanks and the infantry and all the different types of armor. They do have a website you can go to, flamesofwar.com. Getting started, what you'll need. An opponent. This is at a minimum a 2-player game. You'll need 2 armies.
Mm-hmm.
This rule book, not any other rule book, this rule book. You'll need an intelligence handbook. Now, this is interesting. We'll get back to this one. A template. Template is used for artillery primarily. You'll need a battlefield. It's generally played on a tabletop, 6 foot by 4 foot, or 180 centimeters by 120 centimeters. You'll need terrain, which is used and does make a big difference in the battle. It's very strategic. You will need dice. You will need 6-sided dice for this. Rob's favorite, 6-sided dice.
Oh my gosh, don't get me started. What throws me, and I'm sorry, not throws me, but might throw others who might be getting into World War II gaming for the first time is this is not your typical 28 millimeter miniatures game. You may have noticed John said immediately this was 15 millimeters. It's almost half the scale, and that is correct.
It's tiny.
So, yeah, so this was done on purpose, so you could go ahead and actually have those games of maneuver, which were characteristic of the Second World War, and you could actually have some of the actual units engaging in battles using the actual rangers that they engaged in these small unit conflicts. So yeah, that's going to throw some people off because a lot of your terrain may not be usable, especially buildings, and you're going to have to go ahead and buy a whole new set of miniatures and terrain perhaps to play this game.
You'll need tokens for objective markers and a tape measurer. Now back to the intelligence handbook. This threw me off because, I originally came from, a Warhammer 40,000 mentality. You buy an army, then you get a codex or, a general's handbook type thing. So my mind first went to, an intelligence handbook. Oh, I want the American army. I want the German army. I need the intelligence for that because that'll give me the different formations and the stats and the cards and everything I need. I was completely wrong. That is not what the intelligence handbook is for. I found that the intelligence handbook is primarily for scenarios, D-Day. What are a few of the other ones?
Yeah, they have a variety of different ones, including I believe one's called Gung Ho, and there's a few others for each specific, sub-theater of operations. And you're right. But what makes it different than, say, a codex is not only do you now get the units that are there, but they're the historical units that were there,
Yes.
historically adjusted with their point values as well as their different characteristics, which we'll discuss later, such as their motivation and their skill ratings. So those are going to change throughout the war for each side as their training and equipment improves or degenerates. But you also go ahead and have the advantage of having usually all the participants in there. So you only have to buy one intelligence handbook if you want to play out a whole bunch of battles, an entire campaign if you wanted to, by just buying the one intelligence handbook rather than having to buy 2 separate codices.
Yes. And then a battle pack of battles to fight. It's all in one, which is nice. You've got all of your different armies, all of your formations. You have what was happening at that time in history, which is very fascinating.
Yes.
Which kind of would have been pretty cool, like in a history class. You can just imagine, a teacher breaking this out and saying, "Hey, guess what we're doing today?"
It was never very possible in a traditional classroom. If I would have had block scheduling, I probably would have done more simulations in the classroom. Plus, it's also more difficult when you have 30 kids packed in a classroom, so you really can't do that.
No doubt.
But yeah, I've used this as a teaching tool in like a history club and so on and so forth. Sean, I think you've also been involved in these types of clubs at school. Is that correct?
I have, yes. They were, while they were a different format, it was reacting to the past in college, where we would have these specific scenarios, like for example, the Council of Nicaea, and we'd be given a specific role uh, from someone who was there, and we'd have to act out the scenario in accordance to what all our characters uh, believed in or wanted to happen.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I'm sure
So
made
yeah,
it
this is
interesting for different outcomes.
Oh, it made
yeah,
it very interesting, made it very heated too.
People got really attached to their roles.
Well, I remember on the first day I said I was given the role of a cardinal. This is for a different one. It's for the trial of Galileo, but I was given a cardinal. So I decided to start off the conversation because it was getting a bit quiet by saying we should burn him at the stake. That got a lot of people talking very
I
quickly.
bet it did. So how the game works, we obviously roll dice. Uh, on a 3 plus, it means you roll a die, a 3 or higher succeeds. If you need a 7, you roll a d6. On a 6, that die gets re-rolled. On a 5 or 6, it is then considered successful, kind of standard for that type of mechanic. Measuring, it's done in inches. Talk
and
to your
centimeters,
opponent. What's that?
and
Oh,
centimeters
you're
this
right.
game
You're
is
right. Oh
called.
my God, you're right. You're right. You're right. There's the Imperial, and then there's everybody else. Talk to your
Americans
opponent.
can't handle the metric system. Now we just lost the American audience.
Right.
Wait, no one's
We're on a roll,
listening.
man. Talk to your opponent. This is a game. Units get blown up. Egos get hurt. Yeah. Get used to losing units. Communication is important.
Let's take a pause there. I think you're looking at, I love this WYSIWYG. If
Yes.
you don't have a copy of the rule book, WYSIWYG is spelled WYSIWYG. And it's talked about quite often in the Flames of War circles. It literally stands for what you see is what you get. It basically settles almost every rules argument that can occur in Flames of War. So if you can see it, normally you can shoot at it. If I got one guy standing out in the open, that's one guy standing out in the open. So it's a very neat way of going ahead and finding ways to settle any sort of disagreements that can't be solved by the rules. It's what you see is what you get.
Yep. And then they talk about how to read the rule book with the hints and tips, rule highlights. These are things that are important. Reread them. When things happen, be sure to talk it out. If you cannot agree, I love this part that says working it out. Roll a d6.
Yeah.
1 to 4, you get it. A 4 to 6, your buddy gets it. Yeah.
That tends
There's
to
gonna
be
be
a
times
standard
when
in
you.
miniatures games.
Oh yeah. How many hours have we spent debating roles? Henceforth, this podcast.
Yes.
Okay, teams and units. This got interesting because I actually had to read and reread this and really figure this out. Again, we go back to the WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. In the infantry, one man is one man. A team is a number of men on one, those little plastic things, trays,
Hands.
is
Yeah.
on a tray.
And this is where the person who is not familiar with I should say almost all military formations and nomenclatures, as well as for even those who are proficient in understanding how these systems work. This is where miniature modeling and also miniature wargaming comes hand in hand, because most of the people who do this are historians or they want to know more about these historical events. So by keeping things in these teams and units, as you're about to describe, John, is what makes the game realistic. The teams followed by, the squads, followed by the platoons, the companies, the formations, all go ahead and give us a sense of historical authenticity.
Yep. So we have our teams. We have our infantry teams, our gun teams, our tank teams. We have our
And
gun team
describe,
types. I'm sorry, go ahead.
yep, to describe to the audience, in case you do not know, a team is probably the smallest unit you will find in an organizational table when you look at an army. A
Right.
team
So
consists usually of about 4 guys.
Right. So our picture down here, we have a bunch of tanks, and for the people who are actually listening, one tray is about maybe 3 or 4 centimeters in width, maybe an inch and a half or so. And there's usually about 4 models on it. That is your team. And then you have infantry teams. So some of them might be just infantry. Some might be gunners where they have different types of larger weapons on them. Like, for example,
The 75 millimeter,
yes,
75
perfect.
millimeter anti-tank gun.
And then like 2 or 3 tanks grouped together would be another team. And then teams form units, which I highlighted. Your teams are grouped into units. And
Yes,
units
and this,
form formations.
mhm. And the units are usually platoons
Hmm.
to go ahead and make it easier. And then the platoons are organized into companies. So again, this creates a sense of not only historical organization, but will also help keep the game from getting a little chaotic because most people, when they start playing games, just want to move every piece wherever they want to. And that's not historically how things work for various reasons. We'll just call it all command and control as well as morale and elan. But needless to say, we have to understand playing a war game, you cannot move your individual pieces, or in this case, teams, anywhere you want.
Nope.
This formation, these units are all specifically designed not to just have historical accuracy, but also to go ahead and simulate the war and the battles more accurately.
Very much so. So we will be going into these formations later and how to read the cards and what the different values of those mean. We have attachments and combat attachments, and these are all things you'll find on the formation cards. And then we come into our different formations. We have a formation commanding HQ unit with the command leadership using the intelligence handbooks. You have multiple formations and allied support. So there's a lot of, would you say, different ways of constructing an army?
In essence, the way that I discovered it, and it may not be totally historically accurate, but then again, these types of situations occurred actually in history where you would find, a small group of Sherman tanks with nowhere to go, and a company commander would go ahead and say, look, I need you to go ahead and support me on this particular mission. Or sometimes it would be directly assigned to a unit to go ahead and provide that support, which is why you have two different types of formations, I guess you would call it. One is the typical formation, and the other one are the support units. So what you would do is you would construct your formation using the legitimate, historically accurate formation rules. So I would have, say, a Panzer Grenadier company with a couple of platoons and a headquarters section, okay? But then, as in our battle we're about to play, I could have a whole bunch of support units that could either be ad hoc or they could be just people that showed up, that my company commander just, said, you need to be part of my formation for this particular battle. Whatever the case may be, you have to have at least one formation, and then you can have as many support units as you want with that formation. Within the point cost, I should say.
Sure. And here we have the different intelligence handbooks. These are the different ones you're able to purchase, at least at the time of this print.
Mm-hmm.
So we have the late war, the early war, and the Pacific. Both of them for the Pacific.
Yeah, which again I can't find, but needless to say, we'll be using in our battles the Fortress Europe Intelligence Handbook.
Where is that? Is that on this list?
No, it's not on this list, but that is the one that we will be using
Okay.
because it is just good.
Gotcha. And ratings. Now this one, so there are different, let me see. Motivations is rated as fearless, confident, and reluctant. The score a unit needs to pass a motivation test depends on its ratings as follows. So there are different ratings, like when a tank gets hit, does everybody bail out? Do they get back in? Things of that nature.
Right now, what we're doing here is we've finished our discussion about the units and how to construct, in a basic sense, your army. We haven't talked about point values, just for the listener who might be curious as to how you actually construct this. We're not at that stage yet. We are just
Not yet.
talking about how the game's terms are used and how the game's rules interact with one another.
Yes.
So this rule book, and it's a bit confusing because it does go, I mean, literally one page you're talking about formations and how the armies are constructed, and then the next page you're talking about how to read the unit cards, and you're like a little confused. It's a little bit of a whiplash. But in essence, what we're doing now is we're talking about the cards, which are on the a couple pages. Well, you have to go deep into the rule book before you get to a card.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah.
I mean, but the rules do slowly build upon each other. But you're right, they do kind
Yeah.
of whiplash. Just like, hey, we're now talking about this. Surprise.
Yeah. So needless to say, what we're going to be discussing now is how you go ahead and use each one of these units, each one of these teams, and use it effectively on the battlefield.
Yeah. So there's rally, remount, counterattack, last stand, mixed rating units. So the fearless confidence and reluctant, plays into a factor of how well a unit rallies. Are they experienced? Are they not experienced? Are they green? Are they seasoned?
Yes, any war game worth its weight will want to take into account the psychology of the forces involved, their training, and so
Yes.
on and so forth.
Excellent way of phrasing it.
So when you have a unit that's fearless, they're going to find it much easier to overcome fear and battlefield stress. They're going to find it much easier to get their tank up and running again after it just got clobbered by, say, an anti-tank gun from across the cornfields or whatever the case may be. They're going to find it easier to go ahead and counterattack after they've been assaulted by, in hand-to-hand and close quarters combat. They're going to find it easier to stay around when their formation has taken so many casualties. They're going to kind of stick around and not panic and just fade into the woods, and your formation disintegrates. So that's what the motivation rating is used for the most part.
And then we have skill rating. And moving on.
Now, before we move on, this is the very unique aspect of the game. When you look at your skill rating, not only does it give you, let's just focus on one thing at a time. If you take a look, if you're on page 11 and you take a look, it says using the intelligence handbook, skill rating is hit on. What the heck does that mean? Literally, this game kind of flips everything on its head and says,
it does.
Depending on your skill rating and how long you've been out there is the difficulty of you being hit. So your chances of being hit are not directly related to the firer's skill, because that's been assumed that you can train somebody to shoot a gun and it's all pretty much equal. It's pretty much, okay, there are exceptions, I get it. But pretty much everybody is on the battlefield is pretty much trained equally as far as how to fire and train in a gun. There are exceptions. Go ahead and email me and we'll talk about it. But what's fascinating about Flames of War is they take this idea about veteran trained and conscript, and that's how easy it is to hit you in combat, because it says, hey, how stupid are you, conscripts? You're going to be standing out there at the edge of the woods saying, hey, here I am. And then you get shot at very easily. Whereas the veterans,
I just got out of boot camp.
Right, exactly. The veterans are like, hey, up yours, I'm standing behind this tree.
Get your head down, yeah.
Right, exactly. So the game is a little bit different in that respect. So your skill rating determines your chances of being hit. So for those of you who
really interesting.
Yeah, it's very, very neat and very different.
So then we move on to terrain. So now once again we take another 180 and we're talking about terrain. Roads and cross-country and difficult terrain. So when a unit enters and leaves terrain, you have to take certain checks. Like, for example, on a tank, you have to take a cross check to see if it's able to actually cross the threshold between a field and like a forest. And they have a few, they have fences and hedges and walls and craters, and they have special rules for that. And the tree lines, and they should be talking about the cross skill soon. This is one important thing. Talk about discuss terrain with your opponent before the game, because the worst thing to happen is when you're playing the game and you've assumed, and you said, well, I thought that was this, and then the other person said, no, I thought it was the other, but you never talked about it beforehand.
Correct.
So yeah,
For
always go over
example,
the terrain before the battle starts.
if you're looking on page 13, if you happen to be able to see the image, what we see there is right above the words gentle hills, we see a model of a hill with two trees on it. So
Mm-hmm.
one of the players might say, so, oh, that's just a hill. The other player might be assuming, oh, those are woods.
Right.
So that's what you have to clarify what your terrain is representing before you start the battle.
Is that thing in the middle of the road? Is it do I have to make a cross check to get over over that hill? The height of the terrain.
Yes, that's very important too. Is this a
That
high wall
is.
or is it a low wall?
Right. Then we move on to buildings. And again, we come back to what you see is what you get. If you can see the opponent, you can shoot at him. Most terrain features represent quite literally on the tabletop. A house represents a house exactly as it is shown. A hill represents a hill exactly as it is shown. Yeah, I think that's really slick.
It solves a lot of arguments because if you say there's a house there and you're saying, well, I can shoot through that house. Well, no, you can't because there's a house there.
Is there something in front of you?
Yeah.
So I think we're going to end it here because then that takes us up to the turn sequence, and that's going to be another episode all within itself. Is there any other final comments? Sean?
I have no other comments to add to this.
Now, you've played the game before. What did you think of it?
Honestly, I thought once we got a hang of the turn order, it was a very smooth going game. I think our main hang up was going from Warhammer and assuming this game would be exactly like that. It's not. However, the actual rolling of dice is very easy, and it makes it a lot more fun than just sitting there and trying to figure out what's what.
So it was easier. The flow of the game was easier to catch on to. It flowed easier. The things of that nature.
Yes.
Awesome. Rob?
The trend in modern wargaming, whether it be 40K or whether it be Flames of War or whatever the case may be, is to go ahead and start putting as many things as you can, many of the game mechanics as you can on a card that is right in front of each player. So that way you don't have to fumble through any rule books. You don't have to go ahead and look up endless amounts of charts, which was the problem of early wargaming. I mentioned the 50s and 60s and 70s. Boy, some of those games, in fact, I had a game at one point that is the great-grandfather of this called Tractics. It was a old TSR Gaiden games, if you want to go far enough back, miniatures system. And they had armor penetration charts. They had charts for, if you could see somebody. They had charts for if your guys would go ahead and, run towards the enemy or go get a drink of water. I'm exaggerating. But, there were charts. And all these charts
That's a lot
were
of charts.
Yeah, exactly. And the games got bogged down into not needless, but endless amounts of reference. Now, the modern trend in game design is to have as much as you possibly can in front of you. So all I have to do is look at my card, I roll the dice, and now we know what happens.
Keep it simple. Keep it moving. Have a good time.
But also keep it as full of the flavor of the time period as you possibly can.
Absolutely. Guys, I think that's going to end it for us. You can find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify Podcast, YouTube. Go visit our YouTube channels. Subscribe. It's a lot of fun. Guys, thanks for listening. Rob?
Adios.